Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards, with your host, Mel Blackmore.
Hi, and welcome to the ISO Show. I'm delighted to be joined today by our guest, Andy Pavlovic, who's the Compliance Director at Maris. Now, Maris are certified to not just one, but 4 ISO standards. ISO 9001 for quality, 14001 for environmental management, 45001 for health and safety, and ISO 37001, which is the anti-bribery standard. And here to tell us all about his experience of managing this integrated management system compliant to all those standards, and also to share with us, some good news. I know that we're recording this during the middle of the pandemic, but for him to kind of shine a light to say that actually, yes, we are winning business during this time. And so looking at the positive aspects of having those ISO standards in place during these, times of uncertainty. So I'll stop waffling on now and introduce you to Andy. Hi, Andy.
Hi, Mel. How are you?
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, really good. Thanks once again for joining us. I know that you're incredibly busy and you're actually recording this from Eastern Europe as well. So it's great that we've got that international presence for our international standards. Before we begin, could you just give us a bit of insight into something that not many people might know about you, Andy?
Yeah, no problem. First of all, thank you very much, Mel, for inviting me onto the podcast. I myself am an application developer by trade, but I've been involved in ISO standards for over 15 years, both as an auditor, as a consultant implementing the standards, and now as a compliance director for Maris.
Brilliant. Okay. And could you also just provide a bit of an overview about what Maris does, the types of industries that you work within?
Yes, Maris is predominantly a construction company who act as a principal contractor and a principal designer. We specialize in interior fit out, but we also have services in office design, space planning. We manage change for organizations. We project manage every type of construction project from start to finish. We also do 3D modeling and office refurbishment and office furniture as well.
Pretty comprehensive in terms of the range of services within that kind of the niche space. So that's fascinating. So what's your role then? I know that obviously the title is Compliance Director, but could you just give us a bit of insight into kind of what your main responsibilities are then in relation to the ISO standards and what you do?
As Compliance Director, I'm responsible for maintaining all of the current certifications which Maris has subscribed to, which include ISO certifications as well as things like Safe Contractor, Construction Line, Achilles, and some others. Every now and again, the business makes a decision to pursue additional accreditations, which we think may provide us with a commercial advantage or may indeed improve the culture within the business. And again, this is something that I would be responsible for implementing, pursuing, and also maintaining over the longer term.
Right. So it's interesting that you mentioned about the culture as well, because I think some organisations find it quite challenging implementing ISO standards. At the end of the day, that is a document that does need to be interpreted. How would you kind of describe how ISO standards work within Maris in terms of the culture?
Well, first of all, the ISO standards, first and foremost, provided a framework by which Maris can maintain consistency in the work that we deliver. So we start with quality, but it also has an impact on the environment and also has an impact on health and safety of both our workforce and of our clients as well. Culturally speaking, having a set number of processes which everyone can unilaterally follow means that an expectation is set within the organization. It's set and it means that everyone is singing from the same hymn sheet, everyone is following the same procedures, and therefore we can assure our clients as well as our colleagues that we are delivering consistently high quality projects every time over and over again.
Interesting. I think it sounds as though that's going to be really important if you've got different types of projects across different locations, and just, I guess, having that consistency in place just makes it easier for you to manage as well. So talking about managing the ISO standards, so How do you go about managing all 4 ISO standards? Is it an integrated management system, Andy?
Okay, it's important to, first of all, understand that with every standard that's implemented within the organization, it allows the opportunity for an organization to become scalable, which means that if an organization grows or shrinks, the standards support that. You introduce procedures, policies, processes which apply to new staff, which apply to leavers, which apply to any new customers or suppliers coming on board. So this is a very important factor which impacts on the culture of the organization. It means that we're not having to reinvent the wheel every time there is some type of upheaval or there is some type of turbulence within the industry, be it positive or negative. To answer your question relating to how we manage all 4 standards, so the management systems are integrated. This is one of the first factors which makes the management of the systems a lot easier. It means there are synergies in place which help us to manage our time better, and we don't repeat things over and over again simply because we have 4 standards. Of course, the things I'm talking about are things like internal audits, management reviews, risk assessments, and so on. These are applied to all 4 standards every time we set about to doing them. Managing 4 standards within our organization is especially challenging, as Morris is a very dynamic organization and it's a very fast-paced environment, as is the industry that we work in. In addition to in-house expertise and commitment to senior management in terms of their time and also the resources they've put in place with the workforce that they currently have, Morris also employs the help of Blackmores. And Blackmores, they provide invaluable insight, legwork, and assistance to act as a safety net, if you like, or an extra layer of protection to supplement our internal processes. So the idea that you check again, review, evaluate, make the change is something that's inherently evident in all ISO standards. And Blackmores is one of the layers that helps us do that and helps us do that very well. Blackmores has provided invaluable expertise, particularly in new standards such as anti-bribery, ISO 37001, which were new to Morris and generally new to the industry. And I would say probably without Blackmores, it wouldn't be as effective as it is today.
Yeah, I think you mentioned about, 37001, the anti-bribery standard being fairly new standard, but also particularly this industry. So you could say that Morris are actually thought leaders in this field, and that would really give you a competitive edge. But I can see how that's kind of come into the fold as your integrated management system, and the way that you describe, working in synergy. It sounds as though it's now just part of the way that you do things. Is that right, Andy?
Absolutely. It's important to remember that every standard or accreditation that's pursued by an organization has to offer some type of commercial advantage. So we don't run away from that. Having said that, it's also important that every organization accepts a standard as part of their internal culture, because without that commitment, the system will fail. Bribery is a very hot topic within a number of industries within the UK. UK businesses are very proud of the fact that they've achieved a level of integrity and a level of confidence from consumers where we don't necessarily have to worry about that, which is a concern in other parts of the world. Morris has committed to providing the assurance to their customers by subscribing to ISO 37001, which is, as you mentioned, a new standard. It's a fairly complex standard, and the level of expertise that was provided to us by Blackmores and your associates has really shone a light on every possible facet of bribery which are not immediately obvious. That's something that's instilled in all of our staff. We provide them with training at least annually so that they're aware of all of the flags, all of the telltale signs of such behavior. And obviously we have procedures in place to make sure that we're not susceptible to any wrongdoing.
So it sounds like engagement is key at Morris, not just externally, but internally as well, and sharing that best practice and knowledge. So in terms of the training that you do once a year, do you also provide an induction for new employees on the integrated management system? And if so, how do you go about doing that, Andy?
Well, absolutely. As I mentioned earlier, the ISO systems that we maintain are an integral part of the culture of the organization. Every new employee goes through a formal induction. The induction includes not only documentation relating to the ISO standards, starting off with our integrated policy document, formerly known as the manual. But also they receive training from myself personally, and they will also receive copies of various policies and procedures, quality policy, environmental policy, health and safety policy, and anti-bribery policy, which they have to demonstrate that they subscribe to. Refresher training, as I mentioned, is done at least once a year or as and when we see fit. And we may draft in additional resource, third-party suppliers, associates of Blackmores, to help us provide that when we feel that they can do a better job than we can in-house.
Yeah, so it's really impressive that you're kind of setting the standards, setting that bar really high from day one when you have a new employee, coming into the Maris family and kind of, embracing that Maris culture. Because I think some companies struggle to kind of define what the culture is, but I think you've kind of explained it, albeit through the ISO standards way, as being just that integral way of working, that integral part of your culture, which I think is really admirable, because I think some companies without systems in place are just kind of winging it, really, aren't they? If they haven't got that structure, the systems, the clarity on who is doing what, where and how. So it's great that you're crystal clear on that from day one when you get new employees in. I'd just like to touch on new business. And I know that a lot of organisations have been, struggling during lockdown. But do you find that ISO standards help you to win new business? And have you managed to do that during lockdown?
Maris wins new business through a number of different means, one of which is through the traditional tendering process. So much like every organisation that tenders, we obviously have to demonstrate that we are fit for purpose and we can deliver the projects that we promise we can deliver. This is where the ISO standards provide that assurance to the customer. And this is where the competitive or the commercial advantage is gained. Having the ISO standards mean that the tender process is a lot more simple. Anyone who's completed tenders and pulled their hair out for many hours trying to figure out how to answer certain questions understands that if you can demonstrate that you are compliant to a particular ISO standard, then further questions are not necessary, because obviously that then demonstrates that you're meeting the certain set of criteria. So indeed, the ISO standards are, very important in terms of winning new business. Having 4 ISO standards is particularly important and has been invaluable, in particular the anti-bribery standard, because we're an organisation which pride ourselves on it. We've committed to maintaining that standard in the long term, and it's held in very high regard within the industry.
Cool. And what would you say you've learned from your experience of managing? I know that obviously you've got a wealth of knowledge and experience in ISO standards, but what would you say that you kind of learned over the last few years in terms of your experience of managing multiple standards in the kind of a best practice way? So what would you say are the main benefits of having an integrated management system in place based on your experience?
The main benefits of having an integrated management system are the synergies that can be applied to it. So you're utilizing your time in the most effective manner. Processes and procedures which have to be maintained as part of the ISO systems, including internal audits, risk assessments, management reviews, document sharing, training, etc., are consistent across all of the standards. The ISO 9000, 14000 and 45001 all sit on the same framework, as you well know, and therefore the commonalities mean that they don't have to be repeated. What is also helpful is that when we're training our staff and providing them with the documentation and resources to make them aware of what the procedures are, we are more often than not sharing one document, we are sharing one procedure, we are sharing one process, and therefore we're not overloading them with information which they in turn won't be able to absorb. The integrated management system means that everything is in one place. It means that whenever we have to produce any evidence or documentation for third-party audit or for our internal auditors, we can find it in one place.
So it's one central repository. It helps to simplify documentation in many respects then, even though you've got all of those ISO standards. So that's good. Because I think that there isn't much point in having documented policies and procedures if it's just unwieldy and people can't access it or confused by it. So that's good. It's really accessible. And just finally, if you could give a couple of tips to somebody who are looking at implementing ISO standards, what advice would you give them?
First bit of advice, and very important, so this probably goes back to my days as an auditor. Make your system, be it quality, environmental, health and safety, etc., make it fit your organization. If you don't plan on using it in terms of policies, procedures, documents, etc., then you don't need it. Okay, the standard cannot dictate that you introduce any policy and procedure that is not inherently used by your organization. Therefore, every process, every document, every procedure, every piece of advice senior management offers to their staff has to be related to the work that you do and your customer. Okay, it's also very important to start as you mean to continue. So once you implement the system, you gain momentum, you've pulled all the resources, you've trained all your staff, you've put a system in place, you've put in an incredible amount of effort to introduce a framework to your organization. Carry that on. Put a schedule in place every month, every 6 months, every year that will make sure that you are continuing to do all the practices, the process, and the steps that mean that you deliver consistency across. So the idea is that you start as you mean to continue, you don't let it fall by the wayside, and you don't let the quality of the standards drop.
Awesome. Great advice. Thanks, Andy. And I think just the last thing I'd just like to ask is if you could gift a book to somebody, what would it be and why?
Well, as I mentioned, this is quite a difficult one. I'm not an avid reader of fiction, but I do read a lot of biographies. And I think the last book that I read was The Young Stalin. So I would certainly recommend that book simply because it was written in a very concise manner. It's sequential, so it's easy to follow. And it's particularly interesting about an individual who had very little in terms of resources to start with, and he managed to organize himself and organize his life to become something outstanding, without being subjective about his achievements. I think it's a very interesting read. I'm sorry, it's not related to ISO, but as I say, that's the last book that I read.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be. No, that's good that it's not actually in some respects. It's interesting how, you were mentioning about, how you can kind of almost like starting from humble beginnings, but then growing into something in terms of achievements and that sort of thing. I mean, you could liken that to the ISO standards. Quite often, when at Blackmores, if we're implementing management systems, an organisation doesn't have much in place as far as, a direction, structure, organised approach and things like that. And you could say that actually that's the beginning of the journey, but it is about, trying to achieve great things at the end of the day. So that's great.
Well, it's a fair analogy. And I mean, it's probably true of many walks of life, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, most organizations that implement ISO systems, they typically have nothing in place or very little in place and then have to make baby steps. The one thing I will add is that for any organization that doesn't necessarily have the expertise in-house, by all means, consider bringing in someone who does have the expertise. You may find that it's beneficial not only in implementing a system a lot quicker, but also you will find great advice which you can then use in a business sense as well.
Yeah, well, that's great. Thanks very much then, Andy. It's been a pleasure to talk to you today and sharing all those insightful comments and hints and tips that I'm sure that a lot of ISO show listeners will appreciate and hopefully take back and apply some of those opportunities that you've raised as ways forward. And as you said, making ISO standards an integral part of the organisation's culture and having great success with that. So yeah, thank you very much for sharing the time to speak with us today. Just finally, if our listeners would like to find out a bit more about Maris and what you do, what's the best way of them getting in touch?
They're more than welcome to get in touch with me. Contact details are available on our website. In terms of our phone numbers, they can also get an incredible amount of information from the website itself. They can email me, they can email the company email address, and we are happy to provide any information they request.
Brilliant. Okay, lovely. So that's at www.maris.co.uk, and that information will be available on the show notes and how you can get in touch with Maris. So thanks once again, Andy. It's been a real pleasure. And yeah, I'd love to get you back onto the show if you're planning on implementing any other ISO standards in the future, which I'm sure there will be something that you're planning for the future. So yeah, thanks once again.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
So for everybody that's been listening today, there is information on those different ISO standards on previous episodes, including the anti-bribery standard. We did an interview with John Burbridge King on ISO 37001. So don't forget to check those out. And I look forward to catching up with you on the next ISO show.
Looking to use ISO standards to drive better business practice? Contact us at blackmoresuk.com to access further information and book your free 15-minute call.